This and all talks at the 2019 JavaScript for WordPress Conference are brought to you in part by our sponsors Pantheon, a high-performance hosting platform with agile developer tools. Check them out at pantheon.io.
Hey everybody, welcome back to track 1, the JavaScript track here at the JavaScript for WordPress Conference. If you're just joining us, my name is Christy Chirinos and I'm your MC for this track. If you go to javascriptforwp.com/conference, you can see the full conference schedule. We have 4 different tracks on topics on JavaScript, Gutenberg, headless WordPress, and a less technical track where we're seeing lots of students and lots of conversations about taking care of yourself and other items for beginner JavaScript learners. So we have a full schedule today, and I'm really excited for this next one here at 3:30. We have Weston, Ruter, and Felix Arntz. Weston and Felix are both engineers currently working at Google. They're both WordPress core committers and have been involved with the project and community for a long time. They're both passionate about languages, both human and computer. And with that, I will pass on the microphone to them, but thank you to our sponsors. We have Pantheon, Kinsta, and Frontity coming in to make this conference possible and bring all of us together to talk about JavaScript for WordPress. That said, I'll focus in on the presentation and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm Weston Ruter, and
I'm Felix Arntz. We are both developer programs engineers in the so-called content experience team at Google, where we focus on simplifying the creation of great user experiences on the web. And in that, we mostly work together with content management systems. Of course, that's mostly WordPress, in order to bring these necessary capabilities to that platform and make them easy to use.
Yeah, we do a lot of work with AMP, hence this talk, and also progressive web apps. And also we are involved, especially Felix, on the Sitekit plugin for WordPress, which brings some of the Google services to the WordPress ecosystem in a streamlined way. I'm located in Portland, Oregon.
And I'm located in Zurich, Switzerland, hence it's dark outside, which that is not outside, but anyway.
Today we're going to be talking about the AMP framework, and we're going to go through an overview of what AMP is as a framework, talking about the various aspects of adding interactivity to AMP pages, going from using pre-built components to using the actions and events APIs that AMP provides, then going into more advanced interactive functionality through AMP state or AMP bind. And then lastly, we'll talk about some brand new component functionality in AMP script.
Yeah, so let's start with a little bit about what AMP is, what the AMP framework actually is. So AMP is it's a web component framework to easily create user-first websites. And originally, you might know AMP as this thing called accelerated mobile pages, but as of today, that is no longer used, that term. For now, nowadays it's just AMP. It's a web component framework. It's not only for mobile, it's just a regular framework for making websites, both on desktop and both on mobile. You can use it to build your entire site just like with any other framework like React or Vue. A common misconception about AMP is, or has been at least, that it's mostly for static websites with a very simple design. That has never truly been the case, but originally, when it was introduced many years ago, AMP definitely had certain restrictions, but it has evolved greatly over the years. And today, you can build highly dynamic interfaces and highly interactive interfaces with AMP. Hence the title of this talk. And we want to really dive into how you can build these interactive experiences with AMP today. So with AMP, basically, AMP mostly focuses on HTML and CSS as its key technologies. So these are the foundational technologies of the web. So as you can see in these 2 tweets, there is basically HTML, CSS have always been around. We probably all know them, and they have, of course, they evolve over time, but they have been the constant. They have been there. They have been the foundation of the web. While the JavaScript ecosystem is constantly changing completely. There are always new paradigms introduced, and old best practices are thrown overboard. New frameworks introduced all the time, and it's impossible for any one of us to keep up with all of this, and especially then all the performance implications that using all these different tools and frameworks might have. So AMP really focuses on the core values and core strength of the web, which is HTML and CSS. So developers that write AMP, they use these two technologies rather than focusing on JavaScript for the most part. We can basically label AMP as an HTML framework, and being an HTML framework, although it doesn't focus as much on JavaScript, it still supports as much interactivity because by using a declarative nature of HTML to support that. And another reason that the AMP restricts custom JavaScript is that the AMP documents need to be predictable and validatable, which would be impossible if any kind of custom JavaScript was supported. And then, although AMP focuses on HTML and CSS, it's really crucial to emphasize that it's not anti-JavaScript. Again, it uses a declarative nature, but the technologies behind that are very largely inspired by JavaScript. And then, even more importantly, AMP itself is actually a framework written in JavaScript. The paradigms of JavaScript are still crucial for the advanced interactions that AMP provides. But still, by focusing mostly on HTML and CSS, AMP lowers the barrier of entry for creating web pages, because way more people can write HTML and CSS than they can write JavaScript. You don't have to learn all these endless best practices in using JavaScript. You can simply use AMP, and AMP provides you with these best practices out of the box. So even while you could even accomplish the same thing without AMP, it makes it very easy for you. And AMP being so easy is a key pillar for its other goal, which is democratizing performance. It's kind of similar to how WordPress' goal is to democratize publishing. So performance is a key piece of the user experience, which is the primary goal of AMP, and the democratization of that is supported by the open nature of the project. So AMP is first and foremost an open source project. It's available on GitHub for you to contribute, and there's also an open Slack channel where common topics and future development is discussed. It has an open governance model, which is clearly defined and also publicly documented. And so while the project was originally started by mainly Google employees, it's now controlled and contributed by many individuals and companies, including Automatic, Pantheon, Microsoft, Pinterest, Twitter, and many others. And last but not least, AMP is built on the open web. It is not a proprietary solution that only works on a closed platform. The AMP pages, they can work in any browser. AMP is a web framework, so it works on your website. And then also in mostly focusing on HTML, AMP really encourages server-side rendering. So that means that even if a user has JavaScript disabled, AMP pages will still appear in an acceptable way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, AMP is not anti-JavaScript. It encourages you to use JavaScript for what you need to use it for. And this is a minimal AMP document where, again, it's an HTML framework. So it is just an HTML page, but it has certain requirements. For a minimal AMP document to be valid, it has to have these pieces. It has to have this AMP attribute out of the HTML element to flag it as an AMP page. And then it has to have things that most web pages already have, like a meta char set or car set, depending on your accent, meta viewport, a rel canonical link, and then there's this boilerplate style, and then there's the AMP framework itself, which you link to with an asynchronous script tag. And this is just a vanilla blank page that you can then build upon with your own HTML and CSS, including any AMP components that you want to implement the desired functionality, but then as long as you follow the AMP specification to ensure that everything remains valid. So the AMP framework has these three main aspects. The AMP components, the web components, are what we're going to be talking about most in this talk. And they are the custom HTML elements that allow you to easily build with these reusable components like carousels and lightboxes and image sliders. But in addition to those web components, there's also the validator that is used to ensure that you are using AMP components in the allowed way, in the proper way, and then also that you're not using anything in your pages that is bad for performance or security. And AMP has a machine-readable spec, which is used to, in this formalized specification, which defines the subset of HTML and superset of HTML via the custom elements that are allowed. And it's similar to how you may have used the W3C validator in the past. I know I used to always send my web pages through the validator, and I had that little, valid XHTML 1.0 badge on my web page so proudly. Well, similar to that, you can validate your AMP pages in the same way. And again, since it's server rendered mostly, then you can actually use the validator. Whereas today, with so many things that are JavaScript rendered, the AMP or the HTML, the W3C validator doesn't really work with dynamically generated content. And so the validator ensures that the components are used in the right way, and these components ensure performance, so they ensure that your page will be performant. And the validator, there's a validator extension for the browser, and then also, so the intention is that you continually validate throughout your development process, and then also once your AMP page goes live, validation is continuously being performed to ensure that it remains valid. So you start fast and then stay fast. And a third aspect of the AMP ecosystem is the cloud, and that is where when you have an AMP component in your page, the logic for that component is loaded via a script tag that points to the AMP CDN. And those scripts are continuously updated, or I think it's a bi-weekly cycle, a release cycle, so that you always will get the URLs for those scripts, they remain the same, they're evergreen URLs. And then you're going to get the latest updates, functionality and features and bug fixes to your AMP pages as time goes on. So it's like the AMP team says, it's like AMP as a service where you can just relegate that responsibility off to the AMP project so that it can reduce your maintenance burden over time. And then also in this cloud, there's also the AMP cache. And AMP pages are already fast, but in order for them to load instantly for a user, they really need something else. Pages have to be pre-rendered for that to be possible. And so in order to safely pre-render web pages, though, they need to be loaded from a cache, which can ensure that only valid HTML is being pre-rendered, so that, for example, if you're on Google search or Bing search, you don't have a pre-rendered page loaded in hidden iframe that's doing some Bitcoin mining in your browser and killing your battery. And then also, similarly, that the fact that you did a search for some search term, that isn't being leaked to the origin of that search result, so that they can't, set a cookie in your browser and start tracking you until you actually click on that result. And so AMP, as a framework, has this concept of a pre-rendered state, and will only make requests out to your origin server when you actually access that, when you actually click to go to the website. And so everything else, though, in that pre-rendered state is going to be loaded from an amp cache. And that amp cache is not specific to Google. There is no the amp cache. It is platform specific. So each platform should have their own amp cache. Google has their own. Bing has an amp cache. Cloudflare has an amp cache. And it's intended to, the amp cache should be part of the platform that the user is coming from, because the fact that the user is already there means that the service that they're using already knows what they want to be searching for, and so it's no leak of their privacy for their own platform-specific caches being used to pre-render the page. So that's why it's important for the cache to be on a specific platform. And so AMP pages are not part of some walled garden in Google. It's really part of the platform that you choose. And an AMP cache, in order for something to appear on an AMP cache, it has to be published to your own origin. You can't have an AMP page out there that isn't on your own website. You always have to be able to go to your website to be able to, for something to be on the AMP cache. So AMP cache is an additional optional layer on top of your AMP pages. With that being said about the validator and the CDN and cache, now we're going to focus now deeply on the AMP components themselves.
Yeah, so yeah, as Weston mentioned before, there is one of the main pillars of AMP is its web components, its AMP components. So the AMP components which are called AMP components in the AMP framework, they are built on a technology called custom element. It's custom elements, and that is a web API under an umbrella term, web components. Sometimes they're used interchangeably, but it's actually called custom elements API. And summarizing that, the custom elements API basically allows you to define your own custom HTML tags with their own semantic meaning, with their own visual appearance, with their own interactive or dynamic functionality. Also, by being HTML tags, custom elements make it super easy to reuse these components in any context. They're encapsulated, so that really helps reduce a maintenance cost, and also the chance for conflicts when being used in combination with other custom elements or any kind of content on your website. So basically, yeah, they're custom elements. They are a native web API. They work in all modern browsers, and AMP relies on them on this specification to implement its own custom elements, which are in the framework are called AMP components. So these custom elements, they are actually defined in JavaScript. So AMP components are also defined in JavaScript, but they can be used as plain HTML. They're just used as tags. By the custom element specification requires that all custom elements include a dash, and that is why all the AMP components, they include this AMP dash prefix. So the AMP framework embraces that paradigm of having JavaScript for the definition and then HTML and CSS for the consumption. And by that, the framework defines the custom elements, the AMP components, and then when you use them, you simply use HTML and CSS. So it provides a very easy start for a dynamic categories of website. There are basically, because AMP is HTML, most of the stuff you use is probably just the regular built-in HTML tags that you know. So like paragraph tag, span tag, H1, all the stuff you know. There are then two types of custom elements in AMP. There's optimized replacements for certain built-in HTML elements. For example, here you see the amp-img, which must be used in AMP documents instead of the built-in img element. And the reason for that is that these replacements, as said, they provide optimizations over the built-in variants, so they should be used instead. And then we have completely custom components, custom AMP components, like for example an AMP accordion, which make features or which make UI components available for you to use that the native HTML, the built-in HTML elements wouldn't cover. So you would need to use custom JavaScript to accomplish that otherwise. So here we can look further into the optimized replacements, as mentioned, the amp-img would typically replace an img tag. Unless it's a GIF image, then you would use amp-mm. And the same for iframe audio and video. And in all of these 4 cases, the reason why they exist is that they include performance best practices out of the box. The amp replacements include performance best practices out of the box. So, such as lazy loading, so that the image or video is only loaded once the user actually scrolls to it, once it gets into the viewport. Then they also, the amp variants, they also ensure a static layout. So even when the content is not loaded, the AMP document will already know how big these videos or images will be, so that once they are loaded, you don't get this sudden content shifting, layout shifting that we unfortunately see so often today in websites. And then last but not least, to facilitate clients, even when they have JavaScript turned off, you can, AMP actually allows to use the built-in HTML elements inside the custom elements, the variants, the AMP-specific replacements. So for example, you could put your IMG element inside of your AMP IMG element, and that will ensure that if the user has JavaScript disabled, it will fall back gracefully to the built-in variant. And then we have as mentioned, we have the custom components, which provide functionality that HTML itself doesn't provide at all. And these are the components that you would otherwise need to use custom JavaScript for. So now let's look at a few examples for that. One of them would be the AMP carousel. So it's basically a slider where you can, slide through your content from left to right, or right to left. And but it's as you can see, this is the code on the right here is all that you need to have. You just put an AMP carousel, and all the child elements that you would put into it are individual elements of that carousel. And that's how it works. Otherwise, you would have needed to write a lot of custom JavaScript to accomplish that.
Another example is an AMP image slider component, and this allows you to throw up a before and after comparison image, so you can drag between the two to see. And as you can see from the code example, it's just defining statically in HTML an AMP image slider, and then you put the 2 images underneath. Yeah,
another common example that oftentimes you want to use a lightbox for your images on a website. The way to typically accomplish this would be to load like a jQuery library or maybe non-jQuery library, but you would probably use an external library, and then you would need to hook it into onto your content with custom JavaScript. With AMP, you really just need to place the AMP image lightbox element on your page and then associate your images with that. And all that, again, it happens in HTML itself, so you don't need to write custom JavaScript.
Another AMP component that's very powerful is AMP list. And this one is much more meta compared to the previous examples, and powerful, where it allows you to take a REST API endpoint and render it onto the provided mustache template. So in this example here, you can see it pulls the latest post from the AMP blog, which is on WordPress, and then renders out the list of posts using mustache template. And this just scratches the surface of what you can do with AMP list. You can also dynamically change the source URL that's pulling from. You can also pull state from elsewhere in the page to render onto the AMP list. So it's really flexible, and you can do a lot with it. It's kind of a kitchen sink component in AMP for dynamic functionality.
Yeah, another common example is another common example of where you always need custom JavaScript in a typical website is what we call hamburger menu. I guess it's not always a hamburger, but basically on mobile you have a narrow viewport, so you need to hide the menu when the user doesn't want to see it. So for this, we could use, one way to accomplish this is to have a slide-in menu that comes in from the left or right, I guess. And for that, AMP provides an amp-sidebar component that has this functionality built in out of the box. So you simply have, put it into your website and add whatever content you want inside of it, and then you can toggle it with a button as seen here. Notice that in this example, there are these two buttons that have an on attribute, and those actually introduce another key part for interactive functionality in AMP, which we're going to get into now.
Yeah, that's actions and events, or events and actions. Going beyond just the static declarative HTML, AMP exposes an API on elements that allow you to listen for certain events happening and then to perform actions on the page based on those, in response to those events. And you can see that in the previous example, they're very similar to what you're familiar with already in JavaScript in the DOM, where you have an event like click, and then you do some action in response to clicking on something. And actions are like methods on elements, and events are like DOM events. And in the previous example, you saw there was a button that had an on attribute, and that on attribute contains, in its value, the event name, here, tap, followed by a colon, followed by the target that you want to action upon, and then the action itself that you want to perform. And you can, depending on the action, you can also pass additional arguments. So for example, toggle class, you could supply the class name that you want to toggle. And you can also supply multiple, and unlike HTML where you have on click and on mouse down and so on, here you have one on attribute, and then you provide the actions and events in a comma separated list. And when I first saw this, I kind of had a bad reaction because I was thinking, oh, isn't it bad to put inline event listeners on your HTML elements? Because that's what I learned way back. I should put my JavaScript in a separate file. But now, as we have been learning with React, it's cool again to add event callback handlers in line with our components. So when you see this on attribute and you question it, just think about React and the on-click callbacks that it tells you to use. And yeah, there's, as we saw with tap, that's one of the, that's a global event that is supported by all elements. And that's like clicking, just a synonym for clicking, but clicking, yeah. You can also touch your screen, so it's kind of an abstraction of that. And so, yeah, you can then perform certain actions based on that event. For example, showing an element, hiding an element, toggling whether it's visible, toggling a class, and then also scrolling to and focusing on elements, and similar to what you do regularly in the DOM. In addition to those global actions and events, there's also component-specific actions and events. And so the same as in regular HTML, an input element has a change event that you can listen to perform actions on, and also like a form element as a submit event as normal. If you have an AMP audio element, there's a play action exposed, so you can have programmatic control over when some element is playing or not, media element. And then for AMP carousel, then there's a custom slide change event, and then there's custom go to slide action. So you can have like additional buttons underneath the carousel where you can click to advance to certain slides and listen to when slides are changing. Similarly, for the sidebar, amp sidebar, you can have an event that's triggered when you expand the sidebar or collapse the sidebar, and you can also programmatically open and close the sidebar as well.
Yeah. So speaking about amp-sidebar, which used amp-sidebar before to implement our mobile menu, but of course we know like not everyone wants to have the slide-in menu. So sometimes you have your menu in a certain other place, and you just want to toggle it whether it's shown or not. That is a very common functionality, and with AMP actions and events, that's actually, it's very easy to accomplish. because you can just place your navigation element, like in this example here, and then use one of the globally available actions and events, or action in this case mostly, to toggle that element. So toggle visibility of that element, which is used in this case. So we target with using the ID of that element, we target that very navigation element, and then we call it its toggle visibility action, and by that it just becomes visible or hidden whenever we hit the button. However, this implementation has one problem, which is it has issues with accessibility because if you're using a screen reader, for example, you need an indicator for whether the menu is open or not, and for that you would typically use an area expanded attribute and set it to true or false. However, because there's no dedicated AMP action to accomplish that, this implementation here is not quite right. So to address these deficiencies, however, there are other features in AMP that allow for even more advanced interactivity, and we're going to look into those now.
Yeah, specifically that is the AMP component called amp-bind, and this introduces a new concept in AMP, not new in general, but in AMP specifically, where there's a reactive model for scripting on AMP pages. And similar to React, where you can define some state on the page, and then the page can listen to changes to that state and then apply those changes to the page reactively. So with amp-bind, it's very powerful, and it actually allows AMP pages to be what's called Turing complete, meaning that there's theoretically no limit to what an AMP page can do, at least at a theoretical point of view. And it's much more powerful than using just actions, as you can manipulate more of the document, and it's also manipulating the document in a centralized way. And you actually mutate that state by using an action. And in this way, it's called amp.setState. So amp-bind consists of three parts, and that is the state that I mentioned, and that's defined in JSON in the document. And then there are these expressions, which are a subset of JavaScript that references that state. And then you have bindings, which will connect those expressions with attributes on the page or text on the page. So to see an example of that, here's a click counter where we define some AMP state on the page here with the initial value of 0. And then at the bottom, there's a button that will increment that count state by calling amp.setState. And each time the count gets incremented by 1. And then there is a output element, which is not used very often, but it is just regular HTML. And this output element has its text bound to the count state. So whenever the state changes, the count value will then update the text of that output element. And at any point, you can call amp.printState in your console to see the current document state. Here's another example, which is more sophisticated, that shows how you could implement a shopping cart using amp-bind. So here you can see the state is actually here an object that has a quantity property set to 0 initially. And then there's two buttons to increment and more button to increase the quantity and a less button to decrease the quantity. And every time you hit more, it adds 1 to that quantity and sets that state, which then updates the value of the input field. And then the less button will decrement the quantity, but when it gets to 0, you can see that there's this disabled attribute that is bound to the cart quantity state, and there's an expression in there to say that if the quantity is 0, then that's going to equal true, which is then going to set the disabled attribute to true so that you can't click less again because you don't want to have a negative quantity.
Yeah, so on these previous two examples, we simply had a single mState element, but you can actually have as many mState elements on the page as you want. The way that it works is while the mState is global to the entire document, where the entire it's global to the entire document, all these mStates are combined into that. And the way that works is it uses the ID of the mState element which is required to identify the property, the top-level property of that global state object, as you can see in this mprint state call here for this code. Another nice thing about this, the way this is combined together is that also when you call amp-setState and you specify a certain object, object with just a single key here, for example, you only want to set the card, you would only want to set the card property. If you specify the object with that property, it will merge it into the existing state. It will not overwrite the entire object with that value. So it's kind of similar with React. When you call setState on a component in React, it will work similar. And now with these learnings of amp-bind and amp-state, we can finally improve our mobile menu from before again. So remember, there wasn't a way to properly implement the array expanded attribute, but now with amp-bind, we can accomplish that. So there is a very simple amp-state here again that simply indicates whether the nav menu is expanded or not, and by default it's set to false to have it closed in the beginning. And then the array expanded attribute has a binding that is connected to this state variable, and whenever it's active, it will have the value true, and otherwise it will have the value false. With this amp-state, we can even change the text by definition. So now, instead of just saying toggle menu all the time, we can say open menu or close menu relative to the current context. And then we also modify, we also have the binding for the hidden element to actually show and hide the menu. So now in the previous examples of AMP actions and AMP bind, we always used HTML, CSS. And as mentioned at the beginning, these are the main features of AMP. But while AMP has not allowed custom JavaScript historically, so although we can accomplish pretty much anything we like in AMP with these alternative mechanisms that it provides, it still sometimes feels somehow incomplete from looking at the web as a whole. So this is now actually changing because it is now being rolled out that you can actually use custom JavaScript in your AMP pages as well.
And that is made possible through a new amp-script component in AMP. amp-script allows for custom JavaScript by running it inside of a web worker. And web workers are a pretty underutilized API in browsers, but actually every browser supports them. And one reason why they have been underutilized is because the DOM is not available. The DOM for the page is not available inside of web worker. The web worker runs in another thread, and so messages are passed between that worker thread and the main page, and the thread doesn't have access to the DOM directly. And so a big piece to why AMP-script is working, how it works, is this new worker DOM library that exposes the DOM APIs in the worker itself. And if you mutate the document from the web worker, then the worker DOM library syncs those changes to the main thread in a way that doesn't negatively impact performance and ensures that you're only doing things that are sanitized according to what AMP considers to be valid. So this was specifically developed with the intention of supporting frameworks like React and Vue, so you can take your existing React components and drop them into a AMP-script element.
So yeah, now that we have JavaScript, custom JavaScript in AMP, let's actually rewrite our mobile menu from before. Let's look at that again. And now the way that AMP script works is that you actually you need to wrap the content that you want to modify with it in it, so that the AMP script will, because the AMP script will only have access to the elements and the DOM inside of it. So here we simply wrap the button and the navigation item. We then load a custom JavaScript file where you can see the code below. And other than that, it's pretty much similar as the previous example, or it does exactly the same as the previous example. However, now we wrote all this custom JavaScript. So arguably, this code is actually a lot more complex than the AMP bind example from before, and it doesn't provide any benefit whatsoever over it. So maybe I was a little bit overeager to now just immediately use AMP script just because we can, because it's actually not valuable in this case.
Yeah, and AMP script is intended to be an escape hatch in AMP for achieving functionality that you couldn't do otherwise in AMP with its components or with AMP bind. Previously, the way the escape hatch was AMP iframe, but AMP script is much better in that it's more lightweight and it's seamless with the rest of the page. Also, there's a limit of 150 kilobytes for the entire JavaScript, custom JavaScript that's used on the entire page. So you have to be careful about how much JavaScript you are adding to the page through AMP script. And so you can't just take your existing jQuery code and throwing it into the AMP script and assuming it's just going to work. You really want to have a build process in place, if you're not writing custom JavaScript from scratch like we did in the previous slide, to make sure that you have a build process that will do tree shaking to only include the JavaScript that you actually are needing in your application. And being that it's an escape hatch, it's really intended for specific components. You can only manipulate the DOM inside of the AMP script. You can't go outside, so it's important to use it as a componentized piece, as a module of your page, not for manipulating other parts of the page. Not all DOM APIs are supported yet by AMP script, although there are more being added all the time. And there's a compatibility table on the worker DOM repo on GitHub. And actually, I noticed recently that the Canvas API was recently added support for in worker DOM. And that actually brings us to an example that is something that you can and should do using AMP script, and that is
definitely do this. Yeah,
you should definitely. You can use it to create a little, interactive drawing application in your page. This is a silly example, but it uses the code from the MDN docs on the mouse move event, and then ports it over to AMP script. And you can see here that it's just you just reference that code from MDN with some small modifications, and then the button for starting the drawing is just inside. And then when you click the button to start drawing, then it replaces the button with the canvas element. And then as you draw around, drag around, then it will apply those. It will draw those pixels on the screen. So this is more interesting because it unlocks something that you couldn't do previously in AMP. And I think this is some interesting opportunities for making rich interactive experiences on AMP pages in a way that doesn't negatively impact performance. Another example of where AMP script is actually being used for something that you couldn't do in AMP otherwise, and that is this password strength meter. There's a tutorial for this on amp.dev for how to implement that, but you can see that as you type characters into the password field, it'll say whether you've satisfied all the requirements for the password policy. And that's something you just can't do in AMP otherwise.
Yeah, so now that we talked about all these different approaches to building interactive AMP pages, how do you actually use AMP in WordPress? So there is the official AMP plugin for WordPress that, and that plugin, it takes care of the majority of work for you to make your website AMP compatible. Depending on the plugins and themes that you're using, you probably need to put some, put still some developer work into it to get to the 100%, how do you say, to get the last 20% or 10% done, basically. So the plugin supports you on the way there. It takes care of most of it, and it basically also has internalized the AMP validator so that you get this feedback about AMP problems and how you can resolve them directly from the plugin, so that you can then tackle these problems. And then when you get all this done, it empowers you to use all the AMP components we've talked about before in your WordPress site today. And all the stuff that we talked about, you can also find on amp.dev. So that is the main website for AMP. It includes a lot of documentation, tutorials, and other useful articles. And then specific for the WordPress plugin, there's the website ampwp.org. And there you find more information about the internal process of the plugin, how to use the plugin, how to use the validation functionality of the plugin. And then for this particular conference, the examples used here, you can see on this GitHub repository link here. And if so now with all of this, there's tons of ways to get involved with AMP. So you can start building new websites using this framework. There's contributions to WordPress plugins to make them AMP compatible, and you can even contribute to the AMP project itself or the AMP plugin. And by all of this, you can help the web ecosystem to become more performant and more user-friendly.
Thanks a lot for watching, and happy to answer any questions you have.
Thank you.
Weston, Felix, thank you so much for your presentation and for the important work that you're doing. What exactly does the AMP plugin do behind the scenes to generate AMP pages?
Yeah, the AMP plugin is like it will automatically convert, we talked about those optimized replacements. So it'll automatically convert image elements into AMP image. And anytime that there's any kind of AMP equivalent, it'll do that conversion for you automatically. It will also, like for a YouTube video, there's an AMP YouTube component. So if you are using embeds to do embedding in various media, then it'll automatically use the AMP component specifically for that. And then, it takes your active themes, templates, and style sheets, and it'll run them through a post processor, which will again do those conversions. And then if it encounters any elements or attributes that are not valid in AMP, then it will remove them by default, but then it will alert you of the fact that they have been removed. And if you then go into the plugin and it internalize the validator from AMP, and so then it will tell you, it'll identify things that are not valid AMP, and then it will also be able to tell you which theme or plugin is responsible for adding that in the first place, and then providing you with information like the hook that it was output at, the name of the plugin, the function that it came from, and so on, so that you can, as a theme developer or plugin developer, you can easily or be facilitated with some debugging information about where the AMP validation error is coming from, and then make changes to make it AMP compatible. And otherwise, if a theme or plugin is built in a way as it should be to have a good fallback experience for when JavaScript is turned off, the AMP plugin, because it removes custom JavaScript, since it's not valid AMP, if you have that baseline no script experience, then that becomes your default experience in AMP. in the AMP pages. So then you can add on top of that those custom AMP components to add those interactivity, add the interactivity back in.
The AMP, yeah, basically the AMP plugin does probably a lot more things under the hood to help you make the site AMP compatible. The summary is really that it tries to do as much as possible that can be automated, and we work on adding more to that over time, and it supports you with the rest, as much as possible.
One of the most important things is it has a CSS tree shaker in it, so that you can include more CSS than is allowed in AMP, which limits it to 50 kilobytes, and the AMP plugin will apply tree shaking at runtime to try to make sure that you use less than 50 kilobytes of CSS. You can read more about the AMP plugin on ampwp.org and how it works.
So we have one last question. It says, can you talk about how does the AMP plugin integrate with Gutenberg blocks? I like the carousel, but wonder if there will be more AMP components as blocks in the future.
That brings up a good point. Currently, AMP components are only or best used in AMP documents, and obviously the edit post screen in WordPress is not an AMP page. So using AMP components on the editor, the Gutenberg editor screen isn't currently easily done, but there's something coming next year to AMP, which is called Bento AMP, and that's the idea where these AMP components can be used not only in AMP pages, but also standalone on regular non-AMP pages as well. So you could just drop in your AMP carousel in any page, and you would get the same functionality as you would on an AMP page, and you get the performance benefits and all the most of the benefits that you get from AMP page as well. And so with that in place, then we'll be able to start adding more of those AMP components into Gutenberg blocks themselves to be able to do things like having a carousel component or accordion component, block in Gutenberg, and you can just drop in other blocks, nested blocks inside of it. At the moment, you can do that right now, but you wouldn't be able to use the AMP component in the editor itself. So like for the AMP stories editor in the AMP plugin, we actually are generating AMP components in the editor, but we just can't render those AMP components from the AMP project in the editor. We have to basically re-implement the same functionality in the editor so that they render properly.
And all of this, is even going to help your usage in the front end. You can it can also make the whole path to an AMP compatible website more progressive. You can start using the individual components. You don't need to go to AMP at one step. You can start using components and iteratively make it there.
Mm-hmm.
And Weston, Felix, thank you so much for joining us and for fielding the last-minute questions. And I will see you all around the next WordCamp.
Yeah. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.